From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. The big news this week, the dismissal of Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State. The former ExxonMobil boss had been at odds with President Trump for some time. Tillerson had been considered one of the adults in the room, pushing back on some key policies that often drove a wedge between him and the president. Several of those policies related to the Middle East. Tillerson and Trump found each other on opposite ends of the intra-GCC dispute between Qatar on the one hand and the quartet of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt. They also differed over the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and, of course, the Iran nuclear deal. Coming in to replace Tillerson is former CIA Director Mike Pompeo. He's more hawkish on these issues, and in particular his publicly stated opposition to the Iran deal. And replacing Pompeo as head of the CIA will be Gina Haspel, currently the agency's deputy director. Will these major changes in the administration be the undoing of the Iran nuclear deal? What other effects might these changes have on Middle East policy? To discuss these developments, I'm joined today by Ambassador Gerald Feierstein, MEI's Director of Gulf Affairs and Government Relations. Jerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul.
And my colleague, Mr. Alex Vatanka, is joining us by Skype. He, senior fellow, works on all issues Iran. Alex, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paul.
And MEI senior fellow and director of the Extremism and Counterterrorism Project, Mr. Charles Lister. Charles, good morning.
Good to be here.
Jerry, let me start with you. The timing of this decision came right after Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to D.C. and before the visit of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and later UAE Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed. All three had dim views, I would say, of Mr. Tillerson. First of all, do you see any links there?
Well, certainly the timing, as you said, is curious if it's not intentional. The administration clearly was looking to use the visits. It's not only Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed, but also Sheikh Tamim from Qatar is due in a few weeks. And the administration had been looking to use these bilateral meetings as a way of trying to further a political negotiation. As you said, the Saudis and the Emiratis are not trying very hard to hide their pleasure with Tillerson's departure. They saw Tillerson as a major pillar of a pro-Qatar strategy in Washington. And it remains to be seen whether this means that the United States is going to walk away from its mediation role and once again, as Donald Trump did at the very beginning of this crisis last June, side more openly with the Saudis and the Emiratis.
Mm-hmm. Alex, let me jump straight into the Iran issue. You follow, obviously, Iranian affairs, but also Iran policy in this town, in Washington, D.C. Walk me through what you know about Mike Pompeo and what you might expect from him on the Iran policy.
You know, Mike Pompeo, Paul, has been known in Iran, certainly since the time he and two other colleagues, members of the House of Representatives, showed up at the intersection here in Washington. As you know, there is no Iranian embassy here in town, but there is an intersection located in the Pakistani embassy. Pompeo and two of his colleagues, when he was a member of House of Representatives, showed up at that intersection requesting a visa to visit Iran to monitor Iranian elections. It was a gimmick, but the point was clear, at least if you're sitting in Tehran, that here's a man who has strong views on Iran. And by the way, he's been very plain about this elsewhere in his remarks as a member of Congress, even as head of the CIA. He's toned it down somewhat as head of the CIA, but the fact that he is someone who would be very happy to see regime change in Tehran come about is not something that's a secret to the Iranian regime. So I think that's how they've been viewing him. But I'm not sure if they fear him more at Foggy Bottom as head of the State Department. I suspect they probably would have feared him more sitting at the head of the CIA, where he would have had arguably more room for maneuver to come up with ideas of how to, what the Iranian regime would call, destabilization efforts towards that regime.
Yeah, you did mention that yesterday, that interesting point in the MEI flash that you wrote, that they might be more comfortable with him at state where, he can do less of the undercover ops. But given what you know about him and about Middle East policy, Iran policy in this town, what kind of steps could he encourage the president to make? Obviously, the main one, and I'd like your comment on it, is withdrawing from the JCPOA. That and what other steps could be taken?
Look, I think that the way the Iranians are going to look at that issue is that President Trump had, from the days when he was running for office, made it clear that he had strong opposition to this deal. So the final destination for Trump was always clear. He was going to walk away from this. The question now is one of pace. Was Tillerson somebody who sort of held him back? Maybe. That remains to be studied for historians. But from an Iranian perspective, the final destination seems to have been clear. He wants to walk away from this deal, and that's where he was going. Whether Tillerson was at state or Pompeo now going there is just going to speed things up.
Charles, let me turn to you. The arena where maybe somebody like Mike Pompeo or even Gina Haspel might want to push back on Iran, since we're talking about Iran policy, might be in Syria, and you cover that very intensely. What do you see the U.S. could do in Syria with this change in the administration, building on what Secretary Tillerson had already said a couple months ago, that the U.S. was staying in the Northeast?
Well, this is one of the interesting things, because I think U.S. policy in Syria has confronted with a number of very significant challenges over the last few weeks. In particular, Turkey's intervention in the district of Afrin has thrown a huge spanner in the works in terms of our core relationships in the country, and thus our ability to sort of exert leverage over the broader realities in Syria. And so I think the timing of Mike Pompeo's arrival and Tillerson's departure both threatens to make that situation worse, but also potentially pivot U.S. policy on Syria in other more aggressive directions vis-a-vis Iran and
what
in protection
could those be? I mean, actually,
of Israel. So one of the things that Pompeo has actually said since his time as a CIA director, he's repeatedly talked about the importance of creating a Sunni Arab force in Syria to roll back and push back against the Shia power of Iran. We can all question about how practical is that going to be? Who is that force going to be? But I think it speaks to some of his way of perceiving the conflict in Syria. It's not necessarily about Syria or Syrian people. It's much more now for him an opportunity to push back the Iranians, to send a message to Iran's expansionism in the region. But the Turkey issue, I think, is also a very important one. And I've heard from a number of senior White House officials in the last few days about how there is a new aggressive determination in the White House to mend the relationship with Turkey. But this is also where Pompeo's appointment throws a little spanner in the works, because he has been very open in the last couple of years about how he views Turkey as a destabilizing actor. He's accused them of being, tantamount to the Muslim Brotherhood and vis-a-vis a terrorist organization. And I think whether or not Pompeo's personal views on Turkey end up taking priority vis-a-vis the broader US strategic interests, I think remains to be seen. And this will test his ability as a Secretary of State, whether he is able to leverage the State Department to be a more powerful actor within the Trump administration, because I don't think we've really seen that under under Tillerson's tenure. So there's a lot of questions, and I think a lot remains to be seen in terms of where his personal opinions drive official US policy or not. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be a question of personal opinions and priorities and where that all comes out.
Well, let me circle back to what you said at the beginning, that he has talked in the past about building up some Arab Sunni force in Syria in particular, where, Syria very well. There's the northeast where there's Kurdish and Arab sort of joint force in the Syrian Democratic Forces. There's the south, which does have some Arab, if you want to call them Sunni, forces opposition. And then you have the Northwest, which is complicated with the Turks and so on. Is there any space for new actions to happen?
I think what's more likely to come out of a kind of objective like that is not something quite so bold and brand new, but probably more a kind of reconstitution of the forces that we've already created. So as part of this new aggressive White House determination to fix the relationship with Turkey, one of the things we've been offering them is a significant sort of degradation or erosion of the Kurdish YPG's overall command and control authority over the Syrian Democratic Forces, our main partner ally on the ground, and thus an empowering of the Arab components within that force. And I think probably that's what's going to be much more likely. We'll probably, from a US strategic perspective, start to emphasize the importance of eastern Syria rather than the northeast, so emphasizing the importance of majority Sunni Arab areas rather than the northeast where the Kurds are the majority. Numerically speaking, I don't expect a huge amount to change, but our emphasis and our attempts to kind of shape that alliance, I think, will start to pivot, assuming that the US strategic priority remains to fix our relationship with Turkey. And again, one of the things I heard from the senior White House officials recently is that, basically I said to them, listen, all I've heard is northwestern Syria is irrelevant to US interests now. And their response was, no, not at all. We've newly determined that the Northwest has to be an area of strategic interest for the US. We may not have leverage, but our main relationship to give us influence there is the Turks. And that's why we need to mend that relationship. So if that strategic priority remains the same, we may also see the way that the US talks about the Northwest beginning to change in terms of opportunities rather than just threats.
Thank you, Charles. Jerry, we've written off the Israel-Palestine and Israel-Arab peace process many times, and maybe that is valid. And this administration, this president came in saying he was going to do the deal of the century. Nothing came of it in the first year. And then, of course, there was the Jerusalem announcement, which seemed to derail any hopes. But do you see that with this new team, visits by Netanyahu, visits by some of the Gulf leaders, MBS from Saudi visited the Egyptian president before his trip to the West. Do you see any second wind to some kind of Trump plan for the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Well, of course, the administration continues to say that they're going to roll out their proposals very shortly. There have been some leaks, some press speculation about what might be in that plan. Very hard to see from what we've heard so far that there will be anything there that would entice the Palestinians to come back. And of course, one of the big components of the strategy that Jared Kushner appeared to be pursuing was to try to get the Gulf states, particularly the Saudis, but also the Emiratis, to perhaps be more forward-leaning, perhaps even willing to take the first steps towards normalizing relations with Israel as a way of advancing the Israeli-Palestinian issue. With the Jerusalem announcement, although I don't think that you'll see a direct rejection on the part of the Saudis or the other visitors, that's not their style. But nevertheless, I think that it's made it nearly impossible for Riyadh or Abu Dhabi to really play the kind of role that the administration initially was suggesting. So I think that the likelihood is that as long as we're moving forward with Jerusalem, and I don't see that Mike Pompeo is the guy who's going to try to talk Donald Trump out of that, as long as the administration is pursuing its initiative in Jerusalem, I would say that we're not going to see very much progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front.
You expect, continued stalemate there. Would you say the same about the dispute with Qatar, the intra-GCC dispute? I mean, they lost a big friend in Tillerson. Might they be sort of the more prominent losers from this, and how could that play out? I'll mention that MEI's emeritus chairman, General Tony Zinni, is out in the region now trying to mediate the dispute, but he was sent by Secretary Tillerson, who is now leaving.
Right. And so I suspect that there's some nervousness in Doha this morning about what the implications might be. But I would also make the point that one of the reasons that Tillerson and Jim Mattis, and don't forget that Mattis was equally vocal in supporting a U.S. balanced approach to this conflict and emphasizing the importance of a political negotiation and a compromise solution, that fundamentally U.S. interests haven't changed because Rex Tillerson left the State Department or that Mike Pompeo arrived. We have critical facilities in Qatar. Al Udeid continues to be our key military base in the region. That's not going to change, no matter how much people may talk about the desire of moving it elsewhere. It's not going to move elsewhere. And therefore, it still is going to be important for the United States to see some peaceful resolution of the conflict between Qatar and the Quartet, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Bahrain, that allows the United States to maintain its balanced approach in the region.
Thank you, Jerry. Alex, it seems maybe fair to say that we could expect with Pompeo and State that Trump will withdraw from the nuclear deal, and that's, I think, what you were implying. What steps will that engender? I mean, how will the Europeans react, you think? How will Iran react? What does it actually mean for the U.S. to withdraw from the deal?
I mean, look, Paul, bottom line from Iran's perspective is if the United States stays in the deal, great. If the United States walks from the deal, not so great. But what would be much worse if the United States was able to convince others to come along with the United States in walking away from this deal from summer of 2015. And I simply see no signs right now from Moscow, the Chinese, or the Europeans that that's what they want to do anytime soon. We all know about the temperature in the room when it comes to U.S.-Russian relations. We know that China-American relations certainly not one of harmony when it comes to the question of what to do with Iran. And I think the Europeans over the last few months have done everything they probably can do, given their own sort of reading of what to do with Iran, trying to sort of be a bridge, if you will, between U.S. concerns and the realities of life in Tehran, and how to get the Iranians to perhaps change some of their policies, which, by the way, are not just related to the nuclear issue, but broadly speaking about their missile program, Iran's policies in places like Syria and elsewhere. We just had about a week ago or so, the French foreign minister went to Tehran. Now, the French foreign minister was seen as basically a messenger from Washington. He had brought the American message. He was greeted firstly by the head of the Iranian National Security Supreme Council, Ali Shamkhani, who met the French foreign minister in his full uniform as to make the point that, look, we're not going to be able to give you much on our missiles program. We are very much interested in keeping this nuclear agreement alive. But if that means we have to give you everything else, then forget it. That was what the French foreign minister Ladarian took back to Washington, as far as I can tell. I suspect that's as far as the Europeans are willing to go as of today, unless the Trump administration can somehow convince the Europeans, at least, if not the Russians or Chinese, which I think will be very doubtful they can, that really there is something imminent, menacing, threatening coming from Iran that requires the Europeans and Americans to come together. Whether Pompeo can come up with something like that, as I said, I'm very doubtful. I think that Pompeo's personal views on Iran, going back a few years, will probably make the Europeans more suspicious of him and believe that he's really not interested in any kind of a diplomatic solution on the question of Iran, that ultimately what he wants, and more importantly what his boss wants, is regime change in Tehran. And I just don't think the Europeans right now have that kind of an appetite to want to be following that sort of an agenda.
Thank you, Alex. Charles, I'd asked you earlier about Syria, but let me ask you about counterterrorism policy in general. Mike Pompeo was at CIA, tasked with that in a major way. He's now at State Department, a new person at the CIA. What does the counterterrorism map look like? There is obviously still Al-Qaeda in Idlib. There's ISIS in parts of northeast Syria, but there are many other arenas as well. In a few words, as it were, how does the map look, and do you think any of that will change?
Well, I think U.S. counterterrorism strategy in this area of the world is more or less well established. I think we've kind of established ourselves a path that we are going to continue to step along. As I said earlier, in terms of Turkey's actions in northern Syria, our counterterrorism strategy vis-a-vis ISIS has had some significant challenges over the last few weeks. We've seen at least several thousand of our partner forces divert away from fighting ISIS to go and attack the Turks or defend themselves against the Turks. And that's a challenge. But it wasn't a challenge that had anything to do with, changes in the State Department or the CIA. So I think our posture vis-a-vis continuing to close out the fight against ISIS, at least that's in terms of how we will see it. ISIS isn't going to go away anytime soon. It's already recovering in Iraq. But in terms of closing out the battle in Syria, that will remain the same. My one kind of sort of somewhat suspicion is that if Pompeo manages to kind of re-empower and revitalize the State Department, I think that could have a pretty significant impact in terms of concentrating US policy on Syria towards being a more overt anti-Iran, potentially anti-Assad strategy, which is something that we heard from Tillerson, but I don't think the State Department was actually really behind that. I think that was more of a White House strategy. And in many respects, as I said earlier, again, we are starting to see an empowerment of the hawks, who are mostly still now in the White House, and in terms of Syria's policy being less about Syria and the Syrian people and much more about rolling back the Iranians and protecting Israel. So if Pompeo's appointment as Secretary of State manages to reassert or consolidate that empowerment of the hawkish position, all the more significant. The last thing I'd say on that is we should watch out for whether or not the widespread rumors about HR General McMaster's future, end up being true as National Security Advisor. He has also been a source of constraint on the president's more aggressive tendencies, as has General Mattis, which has already been discussed. And so I don't want to sort of get too conspiratorial, but we are seeing an empowerment of the hawks, and those two people are the two people remaining as active constraints on the more aggressive posture in the Middle East, in terms of terrorism, in terms of Iran, maybe even in terms of Russia. And I think all of that sort of obviously remains to be seen. But there's a slight trend that we're starting to see emerge here, and I don't think we should discount it.
Quickly interject one other point, and that is look at Hezbollah. And if you look at the broad Pompeo agenda against Iran, if you're looking at the CT situation inside of Syria, we just had Rex Tillerson in Lebanon a couple of weeks ago, where he took a position that was strong but not aggressive about Hezbollah's activities in Lebanon. We've got a Lebanese election coming up in a few weeks.
We do.
And one place that has often been discussed as an area where this administration can push back on the Iranians would be in terms of Hezbollah activities in Syria and threatening to Israel. That may be something that would be on Pompeo's agenda.
Can I, Paul, one quick comment?
Go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
Very important for us to also remember, because I agree with everything that Jerry and Charles just put out, but let's not forget that President Trump wants to be reelected, and President Trump ran against what he called dumb, stupid wars in the Middle East. And I agree, we are moving in the direction of more hawks in charge, but there is this issue of, is American and the American electorate ready for another, major war of conflict with Iran or anybody else, which will cost billions of dollars? I think somehow maybe somebody's going to whisper in the ear of Mr. Trump that might not be the best for his reelection campaign strategy, and that might be a factor we need to take into account.
Thank you, Alex. I want to thank you all. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Charles, for joining us this morning. And of course, I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. If you'd like to join the conversation, please do so on our Facebook page, www.facebook.com/Middle East Institute. I'm sure we'll be following these and other stories in the weeks ahead. And as always, see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.